I'm Ian Nock, if you don't know me already. I am a consultant working with my own company, FairmileWest. We undertake, and I'm here to talk about the usability factors in broadcast IP transition. But I generally work in delivering services with operators and technical vendors who are involved in those same deliveries. I've done a great many over the years. I think I sat down once and tried to count them, and I came up with more than 20. By definition, it's probably more. It probably also depends a little bit on how you count them, but pretty much in the last 30 years, there's been pretty much one a year or one every other year that keeps you busy in terms of a launch. I also work with various other industry groups, including the Ultra HD Forum, where I'm the chair of the Interoperability Working Group, and I'm also the chair of the IET Media Technical Network. But really I want to start from the beginning, because I want to reframe your perspective without any rose-tinted glasses, because I think we forget a lot of the past. And I did actually promise Phil I wouldn't be always talking about the past, and at least some of this will be in the last decade. We will get there. But basically, starting from the beginning, I'm just about old enough to have had a television with a tuner dial on the front of it. So if you want to talk about usability, it was a devil of a time to get those damn things tuned in. And that was pretty much the first 50 odd years of television, was tuning with a dial. And it took a major user interface improvement to go forward to what came next, which were buttons on the television. Now, I've been accused of having really low quality imagery. That's because all of these images are mine. And this particular one is the last big screen CRT that I've actually got a good picture of. This is actually a television I had as a student, and you can just about see the buttons for each of the channels, and they allowed for expansion here with six buttons. But what goes behind that is probably the things we've forgotten about, what it took to tune one of those televisions, to tune one of those buttons, and also constantly retune them, because they needed to be retuned. So you'd actually have a little knob underneath that panel where you would pop out a little twist, sometimes adjusted with a screwdriver, to actually tune into the actual frequency of which the analog transmission took place. And then I have another little wheel just to trim the frequency tune, so that I actually had a steady picture on screen. So here's a little refrain for you. That's what we used to have to do, and yet we complain a little bit about televisions today. I would challenge any 16-year-old today to tune a channel on that television and actually accomplish it. But things move on. We developed, we went beyond awful televisions like that. We got rid of the tuning hassle so much. We moved to more modern televisions. Forgive me for this picture. This was my last CRT. Lovely Trinitron TV, fantastic picture. Huge, massive thing. But at the end of the day, at least it tuned itself, mostly. But it still had that challenge, it needed to be retuned. Then there were issues with some channels that didn't quite work, particularly because I moved overseas and I had to buy this television to have it work overseas and back here, because you want to talk about television standards? Boy, it was a lot worse in the past. But, things move on, and now we move on to very much the modern television that we're all used to, which effectively are computers with fantastic screen and video quality, and user interfaces that go with it. And that's where it gets interesting with the changes in the actual on-screen graphics that we've had over the years. Starting with one of these. Yes, I did subscribe to On Digital. I really did. And it worked. Ish. Didn't have a lot of channels. Did used to crash a bit. But literally it's fairly primitive. But things moved on a little bit, and this is where we get into stuff that I worked on. So you moved into guides, as you would find on many cable companies across Europe, where, again, the user interface is fairly primitive, starting to get recognisable, starting to get familiar, and I'll return to the word familiar in a moment, because that's really what was coming out of the digital TV report that Richard Lindsay-Davis talked this morning about, ensuring there's familiarity for everybody. But I'm going to go a little bit further than that. So developments did go on, and some of you will be very aware of this particular user interface. I think this is circa 2001, TeleWest, EPG grid. And that's really recognisable what you'd find on TV today, isn't it? Sort of. Then it moved to Virgin Media, and we started to get, actual fonts that don't look like they're made out of dots. That's a massive improvement. But it was speedy, it was responsive, it worked well. And then we started to get new additions, like a picturing video, a picturing graphic on the screen, which showed what was on the current tuned service, along with the EPG. And of course, starting to make use of that screen real estate, we're going to 16:9 of going up to HD-based screens, which starts to introduce some issues, like we have here. Well, this is actually a good one. This is where they've kept the proportion the same, although on a 55-inch screen, this looks impossibly big. On a 32-inch screen, it doesn't look so good, because it is designed for that larger real estate on the screen. But that was about the linear channels that we've all talked about, and that's where I'd stop on the linear discussion and think, just reframe in mind about what that was like in terms of usability. Because then we moved on to on-demand. And this is an example of a mid-2006 video on-demand guide. That's iPlayer. Wonderful. Yes. Oh well. But things did move on a bit, and then we moved into a new era, and this is where it starts getting into the last 10 years, or last 12 to 15 years actually. This is a UI from the Horizon platform, and it starts to show the graphics that were being introduced into those screens. However, are they more usable because of those graphics? Are they more acceptable to consumers? And that's the question we'll come back to. But then things get really more complicated moving into the present day. We have these sorts of UIs that start to get a little bit more complicated because they're trying to blend in content from all sorts of sources, both linear and on demand, from different providers, from different apps. And you can see that in this search result, where the content is not only available on BBC, but it's also available on Amazon Prime at the same time, or BBC, BritBox. But then we have something which is more today, as we are today. And these are examples of UIs that you can see on Netflix, a modern UI of Netflix as of now, and Apple TV. Are these more usable? And I think what the report that came from TTG really says is, for the majority of people, many people, no. Although they do probably couch it in the words that said, oh, older people find this difficult to use. Actually, I would reframe that and say everyone finds this more difficult to use. It's just that people who are younger, people who are more motivated, are more able to solve the problems of trying to find the content that they want to watch. Whereas if I'm, say, my mother-in-law, she's not going to pay any attention to any content that's hard to get. And I think that's the challenge I want to reframe in your mind, is that usability issues on modern user interfaces with IP-based delivery are actually the same issues that are there on broadcast-based delivery as well. It's just that streaming has another problem, in that linear EPG I referred to earlier, showed earlier, that guide and the ability to channel zap, that's not available on every device. And in fact, that almost seems to be left behind, and that's a conscious decision by many people who design UIs. It's almost as if they've forgotten an important lesson I learned in my first 5 years of working in TV, and that is there are many types of viewers. Those who like to channel zap, those who like to type numbers, those who like to navigate a mini guide, those who like to go to the EPG. There are some, by the way, who like to go to the EPG to find out what they want to watch. And then there are those who just do all of those, and then various combinations. And that today isn't actually practice for UIs. You find that UIs have moved towards single modes of use. There's only one way to really use that Netflix UI today. Actually, I lie, there isn't. There is a hidden method, which we all have heard about, how you gain access to the actual different categories by direct means. And that makes it a little bit more usable. But certainly if you look at that UI today, what you see is the content that Netflix wants me to watch. Not necessarily the content I want to watch, the content that Netflix wants me to watch. And you can see actually that Black Mirror had just been launched, and You had just been launched, and Cobra Kai had just been launched. And then I'm out of space. And I've got to interact with the screen to find anything else I want to watch, despite the fact there's literally tens of thousands of assets on Netflix available to me. That's certainly a lot harder. Same with Apple TV. Apple hasn't got the UI clue either. Again, a different UI for different content that isn't necessarily easy to use for everybody. It's just that certain groups find it less challenging to work around the problems. But usability is not just what's on screen. It's also how you interact. This is a wireless remote control. Yeah? You can go up a channel, down a channel, you can turn the TV off and you can mute it. And it made a click noise when you did it because it was sonic. But you know, things moved on. They found that worked brilliantly. It was better than having a 7-year-old boy going to run to the TV and back when he wanted to change channel. But they needed something more, and that's where we had evolution of remote controls to the more typical candy bar style remote control, like this little beast from Samsung, which actually is for one for all, but it's pretty much identical to the Samsung system. And you can see all the main normal key parameters there of a remote control. We gain access to linear, on demand, and everything. So you've got a little app button there. But back 10 to 12 years ago, people had this strange idea. They wanted to simplify things. So they simplified it and made it harder. Because this is a remote control for something that would access both linear and on-demand content. And that's one of the challenges that the report from the DTG talks about, is that this leaves out a good half of the consumers who are viewing the screen. Yeah, because they're the ones who want to peck the number in for the channel. They're the ones who want to navigate an on-screen graphic to select their content. But, you know, people persisted. They brought this particular remote control out. And then some people put that into another remote style and tried to simplify things. And what's shown on the screen at the moment is actually 2 remote controls from Liberty Global in the circa 2012 era. The one on the left, by the way, is the prototype that they wanted to launch with, which they didn't, because when it tested, it was awful. It was not acceptable to anybody. And it's because they wanted to have that simple UI of having just the cursor keys on the top, and it didn't work. Consumers rejected it back then because it didn't allow them to zap channels. And look at the mess that's on the rear of it. By the way, I'm proud of this remote. Wonderful engineering solution. Yeah, my fault. Design, not my fault. And look at that remote control rear with all the keyboard on there for typing in searches, which did not work, does not work. But they evolved it. They eventually went to the one on the right, and you see they put back a lot of the key features of remote control that actually are necessary, like the channel numbers, like the volume keys, like the play, pause, stop. All these things that consumers find actually makes their experience better, but people forgot about them until they had to put them back when they tested it with real people. But unfortunately, no one learned that lesson fully outside of what Liberty Global did back then. We still have this as being what people believe a remote control should be for an online service, which has buttons, yes, but I would guess that many people find that very difficult to use, especially if they're a linear consumer. They can do up and down on channels, yes, but they're probably getting confused as to which buttons are changing channel and which buttons are not, which are there for volume, which are there for pausing and stopping, especially when they software define what they do in the UI based on what app you're operating with at that point. Perfectly designed for the main Amazon UI, but maybe not so good for others, like iPlayer. But then again, people have moved on, and we have slightly better remotes that seem to be optimizing into the middle ground of having capabilities like channel numbers, navigation, etc. But still, it's about producing something familiar for consumers. And then we go on to the other aspects. And this was touched on by Richard again, because one thing changed as well in the last 10 years. Suddenly the operators want to know who you are for a wide variety of reasons. Netflix, one of the first, and look what they gave us, this beast, which may or may not be used in the way they intended it. I've seen people use this for kitchen, bedroom, and lounge. Yeah? Because that's what they found useful, although I'm sure Netflix doesn't think about the data they obtain from these users in that way, but maybe they should. And there's one for Phil. BBC went that way as well. Again, they want to know who you are. They want to provide custom experiences. Obviously, BBC doesn't want to sell you adverts, but they do want to know who you are. And again, the same thing here. As far as everyone is concerned from the BBC, everyone in the household that I live in is me, because there's only one account set up, and I'm sure that's reproduced by many other people. But then we've got some really worse situations, because setting up these login accounts, they get really fun. I've been faced with this. This is a nightmare for anybody. Nevertheless, someone who's in their late 60s, early 70s, figuring out where their mobile phone is in the drawer in the kitchen, not charged, to actually set up and log into a service that they've got. But then some of the pay TV operators have done the same for their UIs as well on their main screen TVs. This is a screen actually from a set-top box that expects you to log in as if it's a computer. Yeah? Awful. Although I will mention I did work on aspects of this, but there you go. The point there is that you've got to have something that works for everybody, and it's not just about the older people, it's actually about anyone at any level who is maybe not so motivated to get to the content as you think they should be. Just to make sure other people don't get away with it, ITVX have this little lovely beastie. I would love to see the average person do the sign in with your TV remote. That's quite fun. It makes T9, for those people who are old with candy bar mobile phones, quite usable. And then of course Disney, which actually you don't get to see this very often, because Disney actually did implement one lovely feature that if you opened your mobile phone application, then it would log you in automatically on the television as well, which works about 50% of the time. But usability is not just about the TV service itself, it's what you expect to have to connect. These are really familiar to everyone in this room. Well, the one on the left is more familiar to British people. The one on the right is much more familiar to those people in the US, maybe. There's only probably a very few who actually in the UK who can get away with a tabletop antenna like that. I've never been able to get one to really work particularly well. To be honest, the one on the left doesn't work particularly well either. And that's another reframing we need to think about. Because we might have coverage of the UK for DTT, but that coverage is spotty in places for a wide variety of reasons, which we'll come to in a moment. But then there's also familiarity with this sort of stuff. This is what the 60s, 70s, 80-year-olds are actually familiar with. Cables that they have to plug in. And I bet they still don't know which end is which and which one they should use. But there you go. But then they've also got this lovely thing which seems to be used whenever it doesn't work, which is amplifier, which slightly improves it working, but doesn't completely solve the problem. So that's about the old world, that's what they're familiar with, and then you throw at them the new world, where they have their nice little router, which they try to hide in a cupboard somewhere, thus making it not work particularly well. Or worse, they can have a full mesh system on the right-hand side, which my wife is now blind to, because of the fact she's got one of those hanging around the kitchen, one in the hallway, one in the bedroom, and she's just stopped looking at this white lump that I refuse to put in a cupboard, because then it wouldn't work particularly well. So moving on from that though, the other things we forget about is this issue for those people who've got satellite dishes, environmental effects, also for people who are DTT receivers, because let's face it, the weather affects DTT greatly. I regularly lose channels, particularly the HD ones in my area. I'm just about on the edge of a Freeview light area, so mine come and go all the time. Yes, lots of analysis, professionally done. The issue comes down to the fact that actually I'm midway between Dover and Bluebell Hill, and they're in a perfect alignment. So actually, my television decides to retune to Dover compared to Bluebell Hill periodically, because it looks the right signal level and looks slightly better, but actually it isn't. But those people who are involved in satellite remember this. This is what I love. People who lose their entire TV service. I've been involved where the uplink got lost because of rain fade. Now that was fun. But it does happen. That's what is brought. These are the realities of broadcast. Atmospheric effects. This is where I suddenly start finding that I can tune into the West Midlands somehow. And I live in Kent. Yeah. Oh, it's fun. It's fun. And of course I live in Kent, so all the transmission powers are reduced to stop us interfering with the French.
Not the other way around.
But also physical things around us affect our transmission and reception. Trees, lovely trees, particularly if you've got a satellite dish which you need line of sight, but there you go. But on top of that we also have the famous bird sitting on my antenna mast and losing its directionality to the actual transmitter, and that affects the signal. And so I've had channels disappear momentarily because of that sort of stuff. Wind as well, particularly if you've got a particularly wavy antenna on your roof. A little bit of wind, and all of a sudden it's losing channels as well. But it's not just broadcast that has problems, because I love this one. I love the headline on this one. 9 reasons your ISP's router is hot garbage. To be honest, most ISP's routers aren't that bad. They aren't necessarily the top of the cream of the crop, but they're certainly not necessarily great usable things for particularly people of any age to make work. In fact, most people hope just to power them on, these work, and you don't go near them again. That's the hope. But of course, the reality, which is why we had mesh discussed, is this is one of our major issues in the UK. Because guess what? America's houses tend to be drywall, glass and lumber. Britain tends to be brick-faced concrete, reinforced concrete and pure concrete, which kills Wi-Fi dead. So actually generally within 3 brick walls or 3 walls, you've lost your Wi-Fi signal. And that's, that's pretty much everyone in the country, because we've got an awful lot of old housing stock. Apparently we've actually got one of the oldest housing stocks of the Western world. But usability is also about what you need to do to have these services. Bizarrely enough, I get asked lots of questions about the licence fee. I've had to become half an expert at it. Because it's surprising how complicated it is. And in fact, I've found some quite senior people in the British television industry who wrote articles about said TV licence and got it wrong. We'll talk about him later over coffee. But basically, the TV licence issue is a cost issue. And I would love to point out here an important point, that it's a major cost issue. It is sometimes ignored by everybody, that this is one of the most, it's universal in its application, let me put it this way, which means everyone has to pay it unless you happen to be on pension credit and over 75. Or if you're blind, you get a 50% discount. But everyone has to pay it, whether you're a single student in digs or a family of 8 in a massive house. And it's the same amount of money regardless. And that universality is key, because that is a major cost when you look at the fact that today you can actually buy broadband as low as £10 a month. And you can actually get away without needing that TV licence, because if you watch only on-demand content, then you don't need it. Barring iPay, of course. But that's an important point to make, is that right now, it's technically cheaper for someone to not have the TV licence and have television from their broadband, and the fact that broadband is used for everything else they do. So much so that there's a government solicitation for information going on at the moment about what is required information when selling a house. And an important thing to note is mobile phone coverage and broadband is on the list, but whether your antenna works or you can have a satellite dish is not, which is a good point to the future. But dealing with the cost issues, there are solutions for that. Just nobody does them. So this is actually saying right now, only 1.2% of UK households who could get social tariff broadband don't. 98.8% of people could, but they don't. And that's an interesting challenge, which I hope is going to be in the reports that come back about the TV licence and how it's going to be changed. The government is at least starting now to actually make some comments about what they might do rather than what they won't do. But we'll see how that progresses. But I would like to leave you with an important set of numbers. These are the latest broadband deployment numbers for the UK. UK as a whole, 98.32% covered by 30 megabits per second plus line speed. We'll come to that in a minute. But it's there at 98.3%. Our current coverage for DTT is 98.5% with 3 muxes. It's only 90% for if you go on all the channels. But on broadband, I could have access to all of the channels today at 98.5%. And that's an interesting number to think about. And as I say, read the Ofcom reports. They've been really good the last couple of years. They haven't got a good track record for their reports, but the last couple of years the Ofcom reports have been fantastic. They're well worth a read. Thank you.